Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here, how y'all doing? So I'm sure as you guys know, when it comes to Crystallized, there are a lot of aspects about this season, especially the ending, that are very controversial and divisive when it comes to the Ninjago fanbase. Again, especially the ending. However, when it comes to the ending of Crystallized, one common opinion that I've seen when it comes to a lot of Ninjago fans is the idea that the original ending for Crystallized was actually better in comparison to the ending that we did get for the season. And in today's video, I wanted to take a look at the original ending that we got for Crystallized, analyze it, and discuss whether or not I feel like this was actually a better ending for Crystallized compared to the one that we did get. So, let's get into this whole thing. So, for starters, let me give you guys a bit of context for those of you who maybe aren't aware of what I'm talking about. So, when I say the ending of Crystallized, I am referring to the final episode of the season, Roots, which is one of the most divisive and hated episodes in all of Ninjago, with a lot of fans, myself included, really not liking this episode. However, when it comes to Tommy Andreasen, the co-creator of Ninjago, he was on an interview on the TTV YouTube channel around a month after the release of Part 2 of Crystallized. And during that interview, he talked about what the original version of Roots was going to be like. And like I said, many fans actually consider this version of the episode to be better in comparison to the version of the episode that we did ultimately get. So now let's actually take a look at the original version of the episode, as well as the version of the episode that we did get, in order to take a look at the stuff that I feel works, and some of the stuff that doesn't. So let's get into this whole thing. So for starters, let's do a quick recap on the version of Roots that we did get, so that way we can take a look at what did happen in this episode. So during this episode, we saw Lloyd, Harumi, and Garmadon fighting against the Overlord. We got a Garmadon fake-out death. Lloyd tapped into his Oni power and fought against the Overlord for about 20 seconds. The original four ninja combined the golden weapons in order to create the four-headed golden dragon. Lloyd used the dragon to fight against the Overlord and defeated him. It was revealed that Garmadon was fine. Him, Lloyd, and Harumi reunited with the rest of the ninja. Harumi faced literally no consequences for any of the horrible stuff that she did over the events of the show. The four-headed golden dragon disappears and the original four ninja lose their powers, setting up quests for the lost powers. The monastery gets rebuilt, and that's where the episode comes to an end. And again, like I said, this is a very controversial and hated episode when it comes to Ninjago, and there's a lot of people who don't like it. So that's the version of the episode that we did ultimately get. But now, let's take a look at the original version of this episode, and what was going to happen in that episode. Well, when it comes to this version of the episode, there are some pretty big changes that are made. So, for starters, according to Tommy Andreasen, Garmadon wasn't actually going to fake his death, but instead, Garmadon was actually going to die during the episode. And as a result of this, it would have pushed Lloyd over the edge, and he would have tapped into his Oni form, using it for a significantly longer amount of time in this episode compared to what we saw during the version of Roots that we did get. And as a result of Lloyd using his Oni power for a longer amount of time, he would have been able to completely destroy the Overlord once and for all. However, as a result of this happening, Lloyd would have been corrupted by his Oni side, and he would have taken the spot of the Overlord, which would have caused the realm of Ninjago itself to be destroyed as a result of an imbalance and there being too much darkness. However, as a result of this, Nia would have shown up, because initially, Nia was only going to be in this one episode of the season. She wasn't going to be in any other episode besides this one episode, and that was it. And her and the original four ninja would have fought against Lloyd, ultimately being able to calm him down, and he would have returned to normal. And according to Tommy Andreasen, after that happens, then the rest of the episode would have played out similarly to the version of Roots that we did get. Now, it's worth noting that there are some things that are left kind of unclear because Tommy Andreasen doesn't talk about. Like, for example, we don't know what would have happened with the four-headed golden dragon and whether or not the ninja would have lost their powers. We don't know what would have happened to the council members, and we have literally no idea what would have happened with Harumi. Although, given that Tommy Andreasen did say that the episode would have played out similarly to the version of the episode that we did get, to me, that makes it clear that when it comes to a lot of this stuff, it most likely would have been similar to what we did get, but there could have been a few small differences. but we have literally no idea because, again, Tommy Andreasen never specified what exactly would have happened with all this other stuff. But anyway, that is the version of Roots that we did not get, and again, like I said, many fans consider this version of the episode to be better in comparison to the one that we did get. But now, I want to analyze this original version of Roots, and again, go over some of the stuff of this episode that I feel works, as well as some of the things that don't. So, let's get to analyzing the episode. So, for starters, we have Garmadon actually dying during the episode. And honestly, this is something that I actually would have liked to see during Crystalized. Not necessarily Garmadon dying, but rather there being legitimate stakes and consequences in this season. One of the biggest problems that I and many other fans have when it comes to Crystalized is the complete lack of stakes and consequences that are present within this season. Nothing that bad happens to any of the characters, there isn't any real danger that the characters are put in because everything works out fine in the end, and everyone gets a happy ending by the time the season comes to an end and everything goes back to the status quo. Nothing really that big or major happens during the season that results in anything big happening to the overall world of Ninjago or anything really changing. Everything essentially goes back to the way it was prior to the events of Crystalized starting, with the only real difference being that there's a few more characters around, and that's about it. Outside of that, pretty much everything is the same, and the only major consequence of the season is the original 4 ninja losing their powers, and even then, that's undone during the book Quest for the Lost Powers. So essentially, Crystalized has no lasting consequences when it comes to Ninjago, which, in my opinion, wasn't a very good thing for the season, because personally, I feel like this results in Crystalized feeling like a really boring season as a result of it, because there wasn't really anything that interesting that happened as a result of the lack of stakes in the season. Now, I'm not saying that Crystalized had to do something like kill off a bunch of characters, because I don't think you have to do that in order for there to be actual stakes when it comes to storytelling. However, something that I and many other fans really wanted to see were legitimate stakes and consequences in Crystalized, yet the season never really did anything with that. So I feel like if there were some actual legitimate stakes and consequences when it comes to Crystalized, I think that honestly would have been something really interesting to see. And if Garmadon did end up dying at some point during the season, I honestly feel like that would have been something really interesting, especially given the fact that Garmadon has been around in the show ever since the beginning, so the show actually killing him off could have been a legitimately powerful and impactful moment for the franchise. Also, given that based on a lot of speculation, it looks like Wu also was initially going to die during the events of Crystalized. Having both Wu and Garmadon die during the events of Crystalized, again, this could have been something pretty big for the show. So again, when it comes to the idea of there being actual legitimate stakes and consequences in the season, this is something that I personally really would have liked to see in Crystalized. After this, we have Lloyd using his Oni power for a significant longer amount of time, and yet again, this is something that I would have liked to seen during the events of Crystalized. Another big problem that I and a lot of other fans had when it came to Crystalized was the lack of screen time for Oni Lloyd. Oni Lloyd as a concept was built up a lot during the events of the season, with the idea being introduced in episode 14, and the rest of the season building up to this idea of Lloyd tapping into his Oni power and him using it to fight against the Overlord, and then during the final episode of the season, we finally got that for 20 seconds. We had half a season's worth of build-up for barely any payoff in the end, and this is something that I and many other fans really didn't like, because again, there was all this build-up, yet the show did basically nothing with all of that. Not only that though, but the show also portrayed Lloyd using his Oni power like it was a bad thing and it's something that he shouldn't be doing, which in my opinion doesn't make any sense because the show had been building up to this idea, so why did the show act like it was a bad thing if Lloyd used his Oni power? In my opinion, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's already one big reason why I would have liked to see more of Oni Lloyd during the events of Crystalized, because again, the show spends all this time building up to it. However, another big reason why I really would have liked to see more of Oni Lloyd during the season is because I feel like Lloyd's actual reason for not wanting to use his Oni power didn't make any sense at all. So, all throughout the events of Crystallized, the reason that we're given as to why Lloyd didn't want to tap into his Oni power is because he didn't want to end up becoming like Garmadon and he didn't want to become a bad guy. Now, on paper, I feel like this is something that does make sense, especially given that during Season 11, we learned that Lloyd's worst fear was him potentially ending up like Garmadon. However, Season 11 is also the big reason why I feel like Lloyd being worried during Crystallized doesn't make any sense, because a major storyline for Lloyd during this season revolved around him overcoming this fear of him becoming a bad guy. That was the entire point of Vex. Vex was meant to represent a dark reflection of Lloyd, showing what he could end up like if he gave in to his negative outlook on the world and his trust issues. However, as a result of Lloyd not doing that and him finding a way to work through and overcome those trust issues, Lloyd didn't end up like Vex and he didn't become a villain. So Lloyd worrying that he'll end up becoming like a bad guy after he went through a storyline revolving around him overcoming his fear of becoming like a bad guy, it doesn't make any sense at all that Lloyd would still be in this position during the events of Crystallized, because again, he already overcame this fear in Season 11, so how come he's worried again? It doesn't make any sense at all. And I feel like if Lloyd were to tap into his Oni power and he realized that just because he's using this power, it doesn't mean he's going to become a bad guy, and instead he can still be a good guy despite the fact that he's using Oni power, I think that honestly could have been something legitimately really interesting to see, especially since the show treats Lloyd becoming a bad guy like it being his biggest fear, which again, this was the case during Season 11, and so I feel like Lloyd getting the chance to face his fear and him using his Oni power to do something good would have been something legitimately really interesting to see. And so again, when it comes to us getting more of Oni Lloyd, once again, this is something that I would have liked to see during the events of Crystallized. Moving on from this, we then have the destruction of the Overlord, and yet again, this is something that I would have liked to see during the events of Crystallized. Pretty similar to Oni Lloyd, something that Crystallized was building up to was the idea of the Overlord being destroyed once and for all. This is something that Lloyd brought up during episode 19 when he and Nia learned about the newspaper clippings, and Lloyd said that when it came to the person who sent Wu these newspaper clippings, they might know how to destroy the Overlord once and for all. And then later on during the season, Garmadon says that the only way to destroy the Overlord is with the power of the Oni. So again, the show set up the idea of the Overlord being destroyed. However, that doesn't happen during the season because instead the Overlord is just defeated again, and according to Doc Wyatt, one of the head writers for Ninjago, following the events of Crystallize, the Overlord went back to laying dormant, meaning that the Overlord is still out there when it comes to Ninjago and he wasn't destroyed. And yet again, I think it would have been nice for the show to finally destroy the Overlord, given that again, Crystallize already set up this idea. But not only that, if the Overlord were to actually be destroyed once and for all, then it would have actually broken the cycle of him and the forces of good fighting against each other. During the events of Crystallize, we learned that when it comes to the Overlord, no matter what happens to him, he's just going to keep on coming back over and over and over again. And so I feel like with the Overlord actually being destroyed, then this would have broken the cycle of him and the forces of good essentially being locked in this endless cycle of fighting against each other for eternity. And if the Overlord were to be destroyed, then this would also mean that when it comes to Ninjago, it would basically be free of this eternal darkness that exists as a result of the Overlord. And it's possible that things could have potentially been better if the Overlord were to be destroyed once and for all. And so again, when it comes to the Overlord being destroyed, this is another thing that I would have liked to see in Crystallized. Something that I would not like to have seen in Crystallized, though, was Lloyd getting corrupted by his Oni power. Out of everything that Tommy Andreasen talked about being in the original version of Roots, this is by far the number one thing that I am glad was not added in, because it wouldn't have made any sense at all. So, like I said, according to Tommy Andreasen, as a result of Lloyd using a lot of his Oni power in order to defeat the Overlord, he would have been corrupted by his Oni side and he would have taken the spot of the Overlord. And this is something that, again, I am glad did not happen, because, again, this wouldn't have made any sense at all. Yet again, another one of the big problems that I and many other fans had when it came to Crystalized was the handling of the Oni, and how Crystalized essentially ignores a lot of the information that was present with the Oni during the events of the Oni trilogy, going against a lot of the information that those 3 seasons established, with one of the biggest things being the idea of the Oni being bad guys. When it comes to Crystalized, this is something that we see constantly presented all throughout the season, mainly through Lloyd, with the season constantly presenting the idea that the Oni are just bad guys. They can only be bad guys, and the only thing they do is conquer and destroy. That is it. They don't have the capacity to care or do good things. They are just villains, and that is it. And we know for a fact that this isn't true. One of the major things that we learned about during the events of Season 9 is that Mistake is a full-blooded Oni, yet despite that, she is still a good person and she cares about others, and she did whatever she could in order to help out the Resistance during the events of Season 9. So we know for a fact that not all of the Oni are bad guys, and the Oni do have the capacity to care and do good things. Yet Crystalized never brings this up once, and instead, the season is constantly presenting the idea that the Oni are just bad guys and they can only do bad things. And the season also acts like when it comes to Garmadon doing good things despite him being an Oni, the season acts like Garmadon is the first Oni to ever do anything good, which again, we know for a fact that this isn't true because Mistake exists and she was a full-blooded Oni. So when it comes to the season constantly presenting the idea that the Oni are just bad guys and all they do is destroy, again, I am really glad that Lloyd was not corrupted by his Oni side, because if he were, then that would have just proven that Lloyd was right about the Oni. They are just bad guys and they can only conquer and destroy, and they don't have the capacity to do good things, which again would have gone against what we saw during the events of the Oni trilogy. Not only that though, but I also feel like if Lloyd was corrupted by his Oni side, then I feel like that would have just made Garmadon's entire character arc during the Oni trilogy, the comics, and Crystalized essentially pointless, because Garmadon's entire character arc during all these installments for Ninjago all revolves around the idea of him being an Oni and him trying to become a better person and him learning how to care about others. But if Lloyd was corrupted by his Oni side and he became a bad guy, then again, I feel like that would have made Garmadon's entire character arc pointless, because it would have showed us that when it comes to the Oni, they are just bad guys, and they don't have the ability to do good things, meaning that when it comes to Garmadon's attempts to become a good person, none of that would have mattered, because the Oni are just bad guys. So again, out of everything that Tommy Andresen talked about when it came to the original version of Roots, again, I am glad that this was not carried over into Crystalized, because again, it wouldn't have made any sense if it was. But finally, there is one last major thing to talk about, and that is Nia only being in this one episode. And I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I am incredibly mixed on this, because I honestly feel like when it comes to Nia just being in this one singular episode, this is something that either could have worked and it's something that could have been good, or it's something that could have been terrible, and it could potentially have been some of the worst stuff that we ever got with Nia. And the reason why I say that is all because of one major thing, and that is setup. I feel like if there was proper setup to the idea of Nia returning and her fighting alongside the rest of the ninja again, then I feel like her return is something that could have actually worked. It's something that could have fit naturally into the story with Nia returning and her helping out the ninja in the fight against Lloyd in order to get him back to the way he was. However, if there was little to no setup for the idea of Nia returning, then I feel like it's possible that Nia's return is something that couldn't have worked, and it's possible that Nia's return could have felt incredibly forced and out of place, and it also could have felt like when it comes to Nia returning, it could have felt like it was only included for the sake of fan service, and that was it, instead of something that was actually a part of the story. But again, if there was actual setup to the idea of Nia returning, then I feel like this is something that could have worked. Now, one thing that I do want to bring up, it's unclear what exactly would have happened with Nia other than her fighting against Lloyd. Like, we don't know whether or not she would have stuck around and rejoined the team, or if she would have known about the other ninja and if she remembered them. There's a lot of unknowns because Tommy Andreasen never talked about that stuff. So that stuff is pretty unclear, and I feel like the show would have had to address that kind of stuff when it comes to Nia returning. But again, I feel like if Nia were to return, then the number one thing that would have to make this a good thing is the actual setup to the idea of Nia returning. Because again, I feel like if there was proper setup to the idea of Nia coming back, then I feel like her return is something that could have potentially worked. Heck, when it comes to Nia returning, we could have even gotten something interesting with Kai and Jay's grief over Nia's sacrifice, because that's something big that we saw from Kai and Jay at the beginning of Crystalized, although the season did nothing with it after episode 6. So if Nia were to return, then this could have been a way for the show to actually delve into Kai and Jay's grief over her sacrifice. That is a possibility. Or again, like I said, if there was little to no setup to the idea of Nia returning, then again, her return could have possibly felt really forced, out of place, or again, just being done for the sake of fan service. So again, I'm honestly really conflicted when it comes to the idea of Nia returning and her only being in this one singular episode, because on the one hand, I feel like this could have worked and it's something that could have been great, or it's something that could have been bad and some of the worst stuff that we ever got with Nia if she was just in this one episode and her inclusion felt pretty forced. And so again, when it comes to the whole thing with Nia returning, this is by far the number one thing that I am the most mixed on when it comes to this original version of Roots. And so that's it when it comes to the stuff that Tommy and Andreasen talked about. Now, again, there are some things about this episode where we don't know what would have happened. Specifically, again, stuff like what would have happened with the Golden Dragon, Harumi, the Council of the Crystal King, and more. Although, again, Tommy Andreasen did say that when it came to the rest of the episode after Lloyd returned to normal, stuff would have been similar to the version of Roots that we did ultimately get. So it does look like stuff revolving around these things would have been similar to the version of Roots that we did get. And honestly, that's the biggest reason why I hesitate to call this version of Roots better in comparison to the version of Roots that we did get. Because while there are definitely aspects about the original version of Roots that I definitely prefer to the version of Roots that we did get, stuff like there being legitimate stakes and consequences when it comes to the season, longer screen time for Oni Lloyd, and the destruction of the Overlord, there are definitely aspects about this episode that I don't like that much. Again, stuff like Lloyd being corrupted by his Oni power, as well as my pretty mixed opinions on Nia when it comes to her only being in this one episode. But again, the biggest reason why I hesitate to call this version of Roots better in comparison to the one that we did get is because I feel like it is entirely possible that when it came to some of the other problems that were present in Roots, mainly the stuff revolving around Harumi, it's entirely possible that those problems would have still been in the original version of Roots. And so again, while there were definitely some aspects about this episode that I feel were better in comparison to the version of Roots that we got, I do hesitate to say that this ending is overall better in comparison to the version of Roots that we did get. However, after taking a look at everything, I do feel like when it comes to this version of Roots, it is a slight improvement in comparison to the version of Roots that we did get. I'm not saying that it's a major improvement because, again, there are definitely some problems that I have when it comes to this version of Roots. Plus, again, I feel like it's possible that there are still some problems with the version of Roots that we did get that are in this original version of Roots. But there are definitely aspects about the original version of Roots that I do feel are better in comparison to the version of Roots that we did ultimately get. So again, when it comes to this ending, while I wouldn't say it's overall better in comparison to the version of Roots that we did get, again, I do feel like it is a slight improvement. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below what do you guys think. Tell me what are your guys' thoughts on the original version of Roots, and do you guys think it's better in comparison to the version of Roots that we did get? Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys. This is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.